Thank you, NYASA, for honoring me in this way. Awards from professional organizations perform a wonderful function in validating us outside of our home institutions, which often are very selective about how they recognize brilliance, particularly if it's coming from fields like the ones we are in, Africanist studies, African studies, and those related Black studies areas. I feel really honored that you thought my work worthy of this recognition. I was told I should also say a few words, and I thought I would frame this within two contexts. One would be my intellectual formation, and that would include how I entered Africanist studies or African studies as a field, broadly defined. And then secondly, to talk a little bit about how I see the current incarnations of this field that we are all in. So let me just probably give you a little sense of who I am. And I say this because often we are unintelligible in the home context in which we work. So my intellectual formation comes from being raised in Trinidad and Tobago at a time when my prime minister was the famous Eric Williams of Capitalism and Slavery. Nightly on television, probably radio then, we would have lectures by Eric Williams on really complex ideas about capitalism, which our families tuned into to listen to at a place he called the University of Woodford Square. This was like a backdrop to my life, and I'm sure I didn't really follow it and probably felt it interfered with my ability to run and play and jump outside. But I think it does have a function because we were in a context in which we were seeing the change from colonialism as it was practiced to a much more defined self-representative function that was called independence. Now, no sooner did I get to that sense of consciousness, it was time to go to university. And knowing that in the Caribbean is only one major university, University of the West Indies, and it was very competitive to get in, and our families were migrating to Europe or to the United States. My family moved to the United States, and I with them went to the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. Right at that moment when Black students were taking over institutions, organizing sit-ins, going into town to withdraw monies from banks because of discrimination and racism, which was still in effect, of course, actually still is in effect. And of course, you had at the same time the rise of African American literatures as a field that was really clearly being defined in a concrete way. So those twin imperatives of the political climate as well as the intellectual opportunities within the institutions provided people like me coming from the Caribbean with an opportunity to really locate herself, in this particular case, into a framework that was intellectual but political, and I still work with those two concepts. Now, keep in mind that we would have, as the larger framing of all of this, Caribbean intellectuals like Stokely Carmichael actively involved and often visiting campuses and talking about the ways in which students had an intellectual purpose in life, not just to get an education, but to actually be of service to their larger communities. This is me. This is what I come from. This is what makes me intelligible or unintelligible to others, and I hope that that really provides a context for me. This is where and when I entered the United States. A very exciting time, right at the cusp of what was called the Black Power movement, and I'm still there. Now, the other intellectual aspect of my formation, which is really fascinating to me, was the way that I entered African studies as a field. I began, when I left undergraduate school, to go to international relations, international law, planning on a career in diplomatic service. I applied to and was accepted to Columbia University and American University. I chose Washington, D.C. because I wanted to be in D.C. I thought that was a cool place, plus my family lived in New York. And one always wants to go somewhere else than where one's close family resides. So I go to Washington, D.C. American University was a place at that time, and the class that I enrolled in was a class that had diplomats who were already practicing, who came to class in suits, And I was there in hot pants and Afro puffs. I remember that day very well. Kind of knew I was not in the right place. Of course, Howard University, with all of its political activities and climate and programming, was the kind of place that drew my attention. And as a result, I would spend quite a bit more time there than I did on my home campus in American University. And gradually decided that I would switch completely and get a master's in African Studies at Howard University. Voila. At African Studies at Howard University at that time, Leon Damas, the founder of Negritude, was on the faculty. He ended up being a major mentor of mine. But this program was also led by a really dynamic scholar from Nigeria called P. Chike Onwachi, who was always telling us about how African Studies was actually in its incarnation, a Howard University project. Leo Hansberry is the name that he would use consistently. And I was really pleased recently when I spoke at Howard University for the Ronald Cummings Distinguished Lecture to go back to that period and talk about the role of Hansberry. Hansberry would actually mentor John Henry Clark. And this is where people like John Henry Clark would get his knowledge of African studies. He would mentor many of the major African intellectuals like Azikiwe and others. So you're talking about then some connections that were Pan-African and built into the normal framework of a Howard University. And on that campus were major scholars, major writers like Sterling Brown. I worked in the library at Founders Library where the Moreland Spingarn Research Center was housed. And one could see Dorothy Porter on a daily basis walking to and from the various portions of the library. This is the milieu I'm talking about, and which gave many of us, people like me, the kind of confidence to do intellectual work. I could walk down to the Moreland Spingarn Research Center and do my research for my thesis and get all the research material I needed, and the librarians knew you and found what you wanted and so on. So this is the context in which I operated. When I left Howard, I was awarded a scholarship to the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. It was a Commonwealth scholarship, which was quite a distinguished scholarship from the Trinidad and Tobago government, which was then setting up diplomatic relations with the Nigerian government, and gave 2 scholarships to students to study in Africa, and particularly in Nigeria. So I go to Ibadan to study African literature because my degree at Howard was African Studies, but with a literature sociology emphasis. It was a dream accomplished then to be able to go to Nigeria because we would read about Ibadan and all the wonderful work in African literature that was taking place there. So I felt really honored to be so rewarded, and I went to Ibadan. And again, wonderful opportunity to engage and be in close proximity with writers like Cyprian Ekwensi. Wole Soyinka came back at one point because he was about to stage Death and the King's Horseman, and we saw that at the University of Ife. My prof, J.D. Elder from Trinidad and Tobago, was doing research on the Yoruba traditions in Trinidad and how they connected to Nigeria, and looking at both sources. And I would sometimes go with him on some of his field trips and see the kind of methodology he would use in extracting information from various Babalaos about Yoruba culture. Now, interestingly, one night he was playing a recording of Trinidad Shango to a Yoruba Babalao, and he said, "Oh my goodness, this is old Yoruba, old Yoruba." And Elder was like ecstatic. So we're talking about really organic connections that one could make then from being physically located in those locations. So my work is African diasporic. I live the African diaspora experience, and I also teach and research and write in that area. This is one of my major fields, and I feel really proud to be able to continue that legacy of those really amazing intellectuals and scholars who provided good examples, good mentorship, and a lot of love. I abandoned my master's in international relations and with a desire to go to international law. But interestingly, years later as an adult, I went back and got an LLM in international law, really because I wanted to feel like I always completed what I had planned to or what I started. I don't like that feeling of not really completing a project, and that kind of is my mantra too. I am very proactive as far as projects are concerned. Now, once I finished, let me get back to just tying in that other piece to bring you to Binghamton, which is my professional appointment that is probably the most significant, and where probably people from NYASA probably would have heard of my work. I returned to Trinidad and Tobago to fulfill the terms of my scholarship and did that work for the required number of years, and then got an appointment as a professor at State University of New York at Binghamton. Binghamton in that period was the site of World Systems Perspective led by Emanuel Wallerstein. So we had a context of a sort of white left intellectual project taking place, which I think is not as prominent now as it was then. But it provided a great deal of cushion, I think, for the kind of activist intellectual work that people like me would be part of. In Binghamton, I was on the faculties of the English department and Africanist Studies departments, and those two twin locations have always guided my professional locations. One, because English, in spite of the fact that it's still very Eurocentric in its formation, following Ngugi wa Thiong'o's logic of the abolition of the English department, which I support completely, for instead departments of languages and literatures, and then of course the other in Africanist Studies. So I always ended up being located in those two joint locations because of my particular fields. Binghamton University also later on would hire Ali Mazuri and Isidore Okpewo, people that you know really well, and both of them unfortunately who we lost recently. Isidore Okpewo was a dear colleague who I met interestingly just as I was leaving Ibadan. He was returning to Ibadan as a professor, and he was like, wow, we should have been able to work together, but we ended up working together at Binghamton and actually produced an edited collection on the African diaspora, edited with Ali Mazuri as well, which was the result of a conference held on African identities and black people's self-fashioning in the diaspora. After Binghamton University, I was offered a position at Florida International University to be the director of the African New World Studies program, which was a brand new program which they needed somebody to give it that required start, and that's why I ended up in Florida at FIU. There we produced two amazing volumes. One is Decolonizing the Academy, African Diaspora Studies. And the argument there was that the Academy is still very much a colonized space, and that African Diaspora Studies has one of its practices to decolonize the institution. And then secondly, the Encyclopedia of the African Diaspora, which came out of a consortium of institutions and organizations and departments and programs around the state, which we call the Florida Africanist Studies Consortium. Now that produced a 3-volume encyclopedia, which includes, published in 2008, ABC Clio, which includes a wonderful range of materials from across the world, which was published in 2008, looking at places like the African diaspora in the Indian Ocean, looking at what was going on in Latin America at that time. Since then, there's been quite a bit more material available, but I want to say that at that point when that came out, it was like the seminal work in the area, or germinal, as some people would say, but also captured and still does a great deal of scholarly activity and scholarly work which was taking place in the United States around that time. So Decolonizing the Academy and the Encyclopedia of the African Diaspora. In between that, my own professional work would be Migrations of the Subject, Black Women Writing and Identity, which looks at the movements of identities and subjects across different locations. And then subsequently I would complete in the in-between space between Florida International and Cornell, the work left of Karl Marx, The Political Life of Black Communist Claudia Jones, which, as you know, is a major book, prize-winning, and which has actually performed the function of bringing Claudia Jones back to full recognition in the academy and also among left organizations, black women's organizations, and has a great deal of circulation as well. My most recent work, which was produced coming out of Cornell in a moment, I should say, of crisis, because when I got to Cornell, surprisingly, the Africanist Studies in the next year was being put under Arts and Sciences, and that generated a great deal of activism from students, alumni. Thousands of people wrote petitions because Africana at Cornell was one of the founding institutions which organized itself not to be within a particular location in the university, but to have the ability to reach and access many other units across campus. So putting us into arts and sciences was a contentious moment and still has left a great deal of scars, I think, in how the program is administered today. So out of that, I did Caribbean Spaces with a subtitle Between the Twilight Zone and the Underground Railroad, deliberately because I see upstate New York as a place that has all of the markers of the Underground Railroad and similarly all of the markers of decimation of indigenous peoples. You actually can see signs that say this was land that was taken or found by a certain person, which used to be an Indian agricultural field. And I've taken photographs of them. Sometimes I stop my car when I'm driving and I come out of my car and I take the photograph because I'm like, really? They document this on the streets. And of course, close to Cornell is the Harriet Tubman House, which is one of my favorite locations to go to. It's the final resting place of Harriet Tubman. But I go there and I find every time I go to that house, the certain kind of energy which is there, which I just imbibe, I love it. So that's Caribbean Spaces. And it's between the Twilight Zone and the Underground Railroad. But it's talking about the fact that Caribbean spaces are not just island spaces, they're continental, but they're also diasporic. So those three levels I wanted to assert in Caribbean Spaces should define Caribbean locational identities, if you will. So in closing, let me just maybe summarize by saying just something briefly about how I see African studies, Africanist studies, Black studies broadly defined. For many, the entry of African studies at the institutional level was meant to address some of the issues of representation at the level of thinking, at the epistemological level, therefore, and at least to provide some sort of a basis to challenge the overwhelming Eurocentric aspects of the institutions in which we work. Now, in many cases, this is a function that African studies has. In many cases, it actually repeats some of the same errors of the larger Eurocentric campuses by not really arguing for and claiming a particular orientation that would challenge the way these institutions see a range of issues ranging from gender, class, sexuality, place, and so on. We often sometimes still use the same terms of the institutions. Walter Rodney has a wonderful quote, which I want to just read for you. Walter Rodney says that Black people are in these institutions as part of the development of Black struggle, but only as a concession designed to incorporate us within the structure. Besides the institution, he says, I'm thinking also of the books, the references, the theoretical assumptions, and the entire ideological underpinnings of what we have to learn in every single discipline. And I think that is still very central, because if we look at the institutions, still English departments still function, probably with hiring one or two people doing African Lit or African American Lit, and if they have one person, they're fine. They would also fight, however, to have 4 or 5 people doing Victorian Lit or American literature. So a continent like Africa and the rest of the diaspora is still represented often by maybe 2 or 3 faculty members. We can replicate this in every single department. In fact, some departments have nobody doing African studies at all. So what does this mean? It means that students are going to walk through the institution often unless they're prompted, unless they have parents who really stressed, and I've had many of them insisted that they take courses in this field, walk completely through the institution and not be touched at all by knowledge which is transformative, by knowledge which gives another perspective, period. So I'm suggesting that we as scholars, as intellectuals in an organization like this, have to consistently recommit ourselves to reclaiming those twin imperatives of politics and intellectual work with which we started. And I think these are the formations which in many ways will still guide us into a better place for doing the kind of work that we were supposed to be doing or are supposed to be doing. So I'd like to thank NYASA for honoring me in this way. Thank you, NYASA. Have a great day. And I'm sorry I'm not with you. I'm actually doing a workshop in Haiti, which is a follow-up of the conference, the major conference we had in Haiti, the Caribbean Studies Association had in Haiti in June. And we promised following a grant from the Kellogg Foundation, that we would return and do a workshop for the teachers that followed up on what we did then. So I think it's a good reason that I'm not at the NYASA conference to receive this award, and I'm sure you would understand, and I thank you again. Thank you so much.